Hi guys! The background footage in this video is going to be pulled from the leveling process of my newest character in Hardcore Trade, which I just recently released a video on. It's simply there to give your eyes something pretty to look at while I talk about something that I've been thinking about a decent bit lately. And the rant that's about to come after this little off-the-cuff intro is pretty much entirely scripted, so let me know if that kind of content is something you're interested in. I wanted to get a script out for this one because I wanted to make sure my thoughts were coherent instead of rambly like they often are. So, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Crystallized Omniscience, the new amulet from the Searing Exarch, is a quite powerful unique, which is nothing really that wasn't obvious and not inherently a bad thing. Boss drops, particularly for the shiny new Pinnacle Atlas content, should be desirable, and this amulet certainly is. However, I've seen some discourse strike up about the community in places like YouTube and Twitter, talking about the omnipresence of Omniscience, and complaints about the homogeneity of builds that it encourages. I want to use that as a jumping off point to talk about some broader concepts in unique design that have always fascinated me, and pose the question of whether or not Crystallized Omniscience does in fact need a nerf, whether it's good design, and where it might have gone wrong. Unique design has a lot of different aspects to it, and I'm really only going to be talking about one of them here. But one of the first questions I see that you need to answer when thinking about any particular unique that you're making is whether it's meant to be something that is build defining and enabling, or simply a tool that can slot into various builds without so specific a function. A good example of this would be the difference between something like Itziri's Step, which are essentially just a really nice pair of generically pretty good boots, with things that you'd almost always want out of that slot, like movement speed, life, evasion, that sort of thing, and the Stampede to stay in the boot slot, which are a pair of boots that can fundamentally alter certain mechanics in a way that you could potentially even build a character around to take full advantage of if you're playing something like a Blink or Mirror Arrow Summoner. In recent times, GGG has mentioned publicly that they want to stray away from the kind of design that leads to more Itziri's steps and more towards designing interesting and potentially build-defining unique tools for players. But obviously, this is much harder to do. Balancing an item that is simply a bundle of commonly available stats, like Itziri's Step, is pretty straightforward. Simply look at the stat distribution on your typically used rares in that slot and adjust the unique according to how comparatively powerful you want it to be. Balancing the stats of something that completely redefines existing tools in the game is a bit harder, as you're just making an educated guess at how powerful breaking or adjusting certain mechanics and systems will end up being. This brings us back to Crystallized Omniscience, the topic of the video. I would make the argument that this newfangled amulet fits into the second category of uniques that I described, and pretty easily. Omniscience takes fundamental systems of Path of Exile and warps how they behave, essentially condensing down, scaling penetration, resistance, and stat requirements into one single stat of raw attributes, which of course then gets converted to Omniscience. This changes the priorities of a build using it drastically, eliminating the need for whole swathes of affixes and allowing you to focus instead on just attribute stacking to solve a handful of the most core problems that characters are presented within Path of Exile. This kind of behavior isn't new, as things like Brutus's Lead Sprinkler and a lot of other strength stacking uniques, like Iron Fortress, have allowed similar mechanics to emerge for strength stacking, and Hand of Wisdom in Action has been a staple of turning stats into damage. But the sheer efficiency with which Omniscience works, turning stats into both damage and resistances, as well as solving your stat requirements still, and the sheer flexibility of it, working with any variety of stat and basically any hit-based elemental build that can afford to give up the amulet slot, is what has made it so universal. This, the flexibility and power of Omniscience, is what causes problems, as it begins to leak from being in the camp of uniques designed to be built around and built into being a unique that can generically slot into most anything. Now, Omniscience will never slot into everything, as it doesn't do anything for, say, a hit-based chaos damage build or a summoner, but within its domain of elemental hit-based builds, it does hold so much power when built into to any reasonable degree that it begins to seem like the only reasonable answer when thinking of how best to scale. I would argue that any interesting niche that it could have occupied is actually lessened if it simply becomes the best option out of the bunch, and is an obvious choice for the archetypes of builds that it can apply to. as any identity it could have had as an interesting investment option is overshadowed by its sheer power. So, then, to nerfs. Everybody's favorite thing! It's all well and good to theorize and philosophize on balance, but it's always dangerous to propose specifics, as then people can more easily pick apart the flaws in your ideas, and there will always be flaws. That said, I do believe that Omniscience probably ought to be tuned down, and the way you would hit it is either by hitting the raw power that I mentioned earlier, perhaps changing the scaling on the pen to 15 Omniscience, giving you 1% pen rather than 10, or by hitting the flexibility, tuning down the resistance or attribute requirement scaling to the point where it is much harder to properly fit the amulet into a build. Or, a third option, of simply tuning via rarity, which I've heard thrown about a few times. If Crystallized Omniscience were to be elevated to a supremely rare drop from the Searing Exarch, more so than it already is, then its dominance over the meta would drop simply by virtue of being harder to obtain. Out of these three methods that I see, or I've seen talked about, I personally prefer the most straightforward approach here, of just tuning down the offensive power of the amulet. As fundamentally, I actually rather like the design, I think the concept here is good, but the amount of damage provided is suffocating out other options for the archetypes that would consider it. Anyways, thanks for listening to my long-winded ramble about why some numbers on an amulet should probably be a little bit lower. I hope what I said was interesting in some way, and if you did find it to be so, then consider subscribing to the channel here, liking the video, or checking out my Twitch channel in the link in the description. I hope to see you in the next one. Bye-bye.